See, it was really interesting listening to the president talking there about climate change and making the point that of the 20 climate hotspots around the world, 17 of them are in Africa. And he's saying that Africa is bearing the brunt of this massive industrialization that has happened largely in the rest of the world.
Yes, yes. Good evening to you, Sally, and to our viewers. Thank you for having me. Indeed, I mean, Africa's always, been exposed to extreme weather conditions just because of the geographical situation we've got right across the continent. Perhaps also the impact of the lack of technology to offset, what we see is happening in the industrialized countries where the massive impact of global warming is actually originating.
I mean, if we've seen what happened in Libya just last week with the Storm Daniel, which came from the Mediterranean, created massive floodwaters, which then destroyed the infrastructure of 2 dams, and that led to the many thousands of people that died. And that is a country that has been ravaged by war. Clearly, infrastructure has been very, very neglected. And in poor countries as well, infrastructure is neglected. We've seen that here in South Africa, what happened in our floods in April in KwaZulu-Natal. April, was it 2021 now? I'm losing track, Yeah. But let's focus on what happened over the weekend, because it was completely startling, footage that we saw. We all know about spring tides, but when did we last see spring tides like this? Have we ever?
This was clearly a unique situation. And perhaps let me start off by saying, in South Africa, right across the world, if you live next to the coastline, the shoreline, you will always be exposed to some sort of more severe weather. In South Africa, living along the coast, we've always seen those high waves, storm surges. They're just part and parcel of living, next to the ocean. In South Africa, I mean, the Cape of Storms, it's not called the Cape of Storms for nothing. Traditionally, Cape Townians have been exposed to these storm surges. But in South Africa, they are normally seasonal, and they are associated with intense low-pressure systems, mid-latitude cyclones that passes across or right across the southern parts of South Africa during winter seasons. And they bring with them severe weather, cold, windy conditions, lots of rain. We've seen it. And perhaps that also speaks to your point earlier, the infrastructure, what we see in Cape Town, the flooding in informal settlements, the impact, the early warning systems that are not in place right across Africa, but also in South Africa.
And we're particularly vulnerable.
Absolutely. But coming back to your question then, what we've seen over the weekend, if we look at South Africa and what we had over the weekend was perhaps linked to, not perhaps, it was linked to an intense low-pressure system that once again was situated to the southern parts of South Africa. We are at the back end of winter season, but we still see those frontal systems coming through and creating those surges, strong winds. Now, you need to understand a little bit about waves. The strong winds that's associated with these mid-latitude cyclones, with the frontal systems, they create friction across the water, and that energy is just transferred because of the contact. And that energy wave is then transferred towards the shallow areas, and that actually results in the actual wave then spilling onto the shoreline.
So you sort of spoken about the weather system as well, sort of the conditions that are operating. Is it then correct to say that this has nothing to do with climate change?
In this instance, no. This was a traditional low-pressure system that actually resulted in strong winds. Now, what we have here can actually be called the perfect storm, because everything just worked together like a good, pancake recipe. It just came together at the right time. We had the strong winds together with the spring tide. Now, twice a month, the sun, the moon, the earth, they are aligned, and we get that gravitational pull that creates the spring tide. The spring tide, together with what we saw, the strong winds, just created an abnormal spring tide scenario, and that just spilled over into the residential areas right across the boundaries of what normally we would have seen a normal spring tide do.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So it is not specifically linked to climate change,
No.
but perhaps a reminder of how we need to be prepared for the changes that we are seeing. We know that climate change brings an intensification of climate patterns, and this perhaps is just a sobering reminder that we shouldn't underestimate the power of nature.
And that's what we do quite often, because the warnings were there. We need to listen. We need to look at the early warning systems that are in place and react.
Yeah, very good point indeed. Thank you so much for joining us in studio and for sitting with me while we listened to the President speaking at the United Nations. That was climatologist Dr JC Engelbrecht, and that's all from me.